With this nearly month-long break going on, doing opinion stuff has been proving a tiny bit tricky. That's why over the course of this week you've been given a video on the 2019 BTCC finale, which utterly tanked, and a video on the BMW Sauber years, which also didn't do particularly well. So it seems that doing the opinion stuff is the stuff that's paying at the minute. But today I have actually got an opinion video for you because I saw something on the BBC Sport website yesterday that looked interesting, and it was basically titled, "Where have the Gladiators gone in Formula 1? And if you are as old as I am, Gladiators was a Saturday night game show on ITV that can only be described as Ninja Warrior cranked up to 11. Ulrika Johnson and Justin Fashanu presenting as Have-A-Go heroes went to the National Indoor Arena in Birmingham and had 7 colours of shit kicked out of them by bodybuilders and ex-gymnasts. And when you read into the dark side of the spandex, half of them were on steroids, the other half were on painkillers, they were sleeping with each other, and then Jet, who was by far the most popular gladiator of the lot, almost broke her neck and had to stop competing, so the ratings dropped. They've tried to revive Gladiators twice since it originally ended in the early 2000s, once on Sky and now the current series on the BBC, and they haven't been quite the same because it was just of its time. It was very 1990s. Much like Robot Wars was, and Robot Wars is another subject that I could talk about all day. So now you're thinking, why have you interrupted a video on Formula 1 to talk about a show I've never heard about because I live in Belgium, and you've decided to shoehorn your first crush in there for good measure? Because pop culture references seem to tug on the memory strings for some people, and they like it, and I put them in here and there to just have a little bit of fun and to make sure that you're still listening. But to the more serious point, it helps me get to the point of the video, or at least it'll be one of the recurring themes. Probably. It was a different time. Much like the attitudes and culture today are different to the attitudes and culture of the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, as we've just seen. I've been watching some of those old episodes of Law & Order SVU on Netflix, and the attitudes expressed by the characters back in 2006, 2007 have not aged well at all if you put them up against modern standards. And this video comes because of, like I mentioned, a BBC article which forms part of a wider series called Formula 1 in 10 Years. It's all written by Matt Warwick and offers some good questions. Another article he's written is called Has the Cost Cap Resulted in Better Racing? And in a way that might actually be a yes. But that all depends on where things go over the next couple of years, because just as things are settling, Formula 1 is hitting the reset button again. Typical. And it all comes at a good point in time, because this year is 30 years since Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna were killed at Imola, after which a conscious, professional and unwavering attitude to safety began, and changed the way the sport worked forever. But so many things around it have changed too. Back in the days of pre-war racing, a crash was considered part of the spectacle. After the war, seeing or hearing of somebody killed in a racing crash was just an accepted danger of what was going on. During the 1955 season, the world was only 10 years past the end of the Second World War, so when the 1955 Le Mans disaster happened, many were given flashbacks to the time when the French countryside was a battlefield. The older generations who were there might have remembered a time when the eastern end of the country and into Belgium was a maze of trenches, and those people might have been in those trenches themselves. But it was not until the 1960s that a group of men in the sport decided they were going to try and change things. In 1961, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, the Union of Formula 1 drivers, was set up, with Stirling Moss being the first chairman of the group following an election by its members. When Moss retired from Formula 1, Joe Bonnier became the chairman. And this was all before a pious little Scot with beady eyes joined the sport. The group back then did as it does now. They form a collective voice to make the FIA and circuit owners change things to suit the drivers and the way the cars function out on track, because many voices are more powerful than just the one. But still, in those days, drivers were considered gladiators. They were still going out with the very real possibility of them not returning at the end of the race, either because they'd been carted off to a hospital or they were being pronounced dead at the scene of a crash. They were chain smoking like it was going out of fashion. They'd drink, they'd womanize, they'd do a lot of stuff that, over the last 60 or 70 years, has sort of gone by the wayside. Because they were real men doing a real man's sport. They were racing around the old Spa-Francorchamps that was 8 miles long and had the notorious Master Kink. They were going to Rouen, No Chicane Monza, the Nürburgring, because these were men's men and they went in knowing all the risks. But Jim Clark, though, actually hated Spa. Probably why he won so many times there. He wanted it over and done with. But these blokes were going out there, strapping themselves into actual bombs and knowing that it might be the last time they were going to do it. But they did it anyway, even though they knew it was stupid and they were probably going to get themselves killed if they did it. People say they were just braver back then. Others say that they might have been a little bit crazy. And in a way, you have to be a little bit crazy, because any sane person, at least with 2024 eyes, will be sat there going, what am I doing? I should be in the pub. What am I doing in this car? Get me to the pub. See also the Isle of Man. But then into the late 1960s, a shift began to change. Jackie Stewart had his crash during the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix, where he crashed at the Master King and was trapped in his BRM. I've told this story loads of times before, but if you don't know it, the long and short of it is that Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant had also crashed nearby and came to help Jackie, and Jackie was covered in fuel and had several broken bones. When Bob and Graham finally got Jackie out of the car, having to borrow a toolkit from a spectator, they got into a medical tent that was dirty and not even fit for the battlefields of Vietnam. And when they finally got around to getting Jackie to a hospital, the ambulance driver got lost. So things had to change. Again, this is all a common knowledge story that Jackie and the GPDA started to push for better medical coverage and better trackside safety, but the circuit owners resisted. If you don't like it, slow down, stop being such a wimp, stop being so soft, play golf if you don't like it, and so on. If you've heard these stories before, I can only apologise, but I do find the safety aspect of Formula 1 fascinating, so it's been a big part of the channel over the last 6 years, and I'll have repeated this story loads of times. But this serves as background to where things have led to today with the opinions that people have, so I at least think it's important to provide background context, even if it can take a while to get through it all. Imagine skipping to the end of Empire Strikes Back and going, hang on, who's Obi-Wan Kenobi? What's going on? It's because you've skipped all the bits that you need to know. It wasn't until Jim Clark was killed in 1968 that the attitude started to change. The attitude then became, oh my god, Jim Clark was killed. Well, if Jimmy can be killed in a racing car, I can be killed in a racing car because Jimmy is too good to be killed in a racing car. I've been saying for all this time that it will happen to somebody else, but I'm somebody else is somebody else. Oh yeah, things need to change around here because I want to go home to my wife next weekend. And Jackie Stewart could see the hypocrisy in it all. He knew it was all dangerous. He knew it was probably going to kill him at some point. But in his mind, if he could reduce the amount of unnecessary deaths in the sport, then that would be a step in the right direction. Take Jim Clark's death at Hockenheim in 1968. Back then, there was no barrier between the track and the trees. If there was a barrier, there's a chance that Jim would have simply bounced off the barrier and slid to a stop at the side of the road. Instead, he ended up going into the forest, pinballed off a few trees, and then came to a stop. By which point, he was dead. And I'm sure people have asked that question a number of times, either at the time or now. Why didn't they just walk away? Why didn't Jackie, Graham, Jack, Jochen, Bonnier and all those guys just walk away if they were saying it was too dangerous and it was stupid that they were racing? And it is a good question. I guess it's because they don't know anything else. What else are they qualified to do? Where else are they going to get employment? What can they do that will pay the same wages as what they were getting as racing drivers? It's one of those, I guess. And even those who became two of the most powerful men in the sport, Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley, made a deal with each other that if they ever entered positions of power within motor racing, they'd do whatever it took to reduce what they would call unnecessary death. But I think the way that Stewart's mind was working was, if I have an accident and I get killed, I've had an accident and I've been killed. That's just part and parcel of racing. It happens, accidents happen. But if I've had an accident and been killed because this wasn't there, this wasn't there, this wasn't there, and this wasn't there, like simple things like a barrier or seatbelts or whatever it might be, then that is unacceptable. We're trying to reduce unnecessary death. I mean, all death in sport is unnecessary, but it's like the steps you take to minimize that. If you reduce the chances to an acceptable level of chances, then it becomes acceptable. I think you see where I'm going with this. Fast forward to the 1982 season, and this saw the deaths of Gilles Villeneuve, Riccardo Paletti, and the career-ending shunt for Didier Pironi. There were accidents, and accidents happen, but things had to change, so ground effect was banned to try and slow the cars down. Following this, Formula 1 went 12 years without a death at a race weekend, even with the massive fireball that Gerhard Berger was involved with when he crashed at Tamburello Corner. But even then, with all the safety things that had changed between Clark's fatal crash in 1968 and now, 1982-ish, Formula 1 still seemed to have that thing about it that we look back on and go, oh, he was a character. Piquet, Rosberg, guys like that. And the cars that they drove were getting on for the 1,000 horsepower qualifying missiles that they became, being driven on the ragged edge because of the 3 to 5 business days of turbo lag that they'd have, and they didn't have the aero and mechanical grip to put all that power down properly. Even back then, with Bernie and his Concord agreements and the sport transitioning properly onto television, Formula One still had an element of ragtag amateurishness about it. The paddocks were tightly packed. The pit lanes were also tightly packed. The pits at Brands Hatch today aren't much different to how they were in the 80s, while somewhere like Silverstone has had to go through a modernisation program to get it up to snuff with the other tracks on the calendar. Spa too. I can't describe it, but there was something about it that still had a rawness to it. Even though the safety aspect had increased a lot, on the face of it, it was still dangerous. But because of the Concord agreement, the drivers and teams were going to be making way more money than they'd ever done before. Add in that the best way of making money at this time was cigarette sponsorship, and smoking wasn't the health hazard that it is today. Many of the drivers smoked, and fitness wasn't something that many of them took that seriously, but would start to take seriously as the downforce levels on the cars ramped up again following the ground effect ban in 1983. Cigarette sponsors, grid girls in outfits that left little to the imagination, and cars that basically couldn't put the power down properly because the mechanical and aero grip wasn't there yet. Because the cars were dancing around and sliding and doing all this stuff, it created this illusion that these drivers were able to tame these uncontrollable monsters, and that elevated that legend of these drivers. From 1966 to around sort of 1987, the drivers were still gladiators in the traditional sense. They were going out into the Colosseum armed with nothing but a small dagger and expected to tame the lions that were inside, with the knowledge that they wouldn't come back out of that Colosseum if they failed to tame them. But as Jackie Stewart said, none of that mattered when the helmet was on, but those outside the driving aspect would all be looking at this and going, well, you signed up to this, play with fire, get burnt. By the 1990s though, things had completely changed. Formula One was way more accessible on television, the sponsors were now being given way more airtime and putting more money into the sport, and the deaths of Senna and Ratzenberger led Formula One into making sweeping changes, because Formula One was shamed into making those changes, much like they had been after the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. Chicanes were put in places where chicanes weren't there before. Runoff extended to allow the cars ample time to slow down before impacting with a wall. High cockpit sides were made mandatory for 1996, which had they been in a year before would have probably saved Mika Hakkinen serious injury in his Adelaide 1995 shunt. But even with the increase in money, budgets and so on, the cars and the drivers remained stars. The cars then got their signature sound in the sort of early 2000s as the V10 engine started to rev a tiny bit higher, a noise that many people still associate with the sport even today. If you look at the Amazon AWS advert that you might have seen on TV, or you might be seeing it in an advert in this very video, there is a modern Formula One car, a hybrid Formula One car in that video. But the noise on the top, it's a V10. The V10 engine plus all of that other stuff gave the mythical status to the cars. You've also got the emergence of Michael Schumacher and the return to the top of Ferrari, Formula One's biggest name. Schumacher became a household name all over the world, and his ruthless nature on the track became all part of the show. You didn't need to watch Formula One to know who Michael Schumacher is. Same way that Damon Hill was a household name here in the UK, along with people like David Beckham, Tim Henman and Stephen Hendry. But Schumacher, he transcended the sport entirely. So anybody who was in a battle with Michael Schumacher for a title was automatically elevated up there too. Villeneuve in 1997, Hakkinen in 1998 and 2000. Yeah, okay, there's 1999 too, but Schumacher broke his leg at Silverstone and that ended that title fight. But the problem was, Schumacher might have been a bit too successful. Interest started to wane until Alonso came along, and the 2006 season, more so than the 2005 season, sort of allowed that gladiator tag to come back a bit. Instead of taming the lions, the cars in this case, this was 1v1, fight to the death, winner takes all, with Alonso standing on his car come the season's conclusion and screaming, "Are you not entertained?" in Spanish. The cars and circuits were now at a point where the fights were between the drivers, rather than the drivers fighting not just the other drivers on the track, but the cars and the circuits. And this was before social media became the massive thing that it is today. Yes, we had Bebo and yes, we had MySpace, but YouTube wasn't a thing back then with all these clips being added to it. And I think that social media has done a little bit to take the edge off this whole gladiator aspect. Because of social media, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube and bits and pieces like that, we have unprecedented access to whatever it is our favourite sportsmen and women are up to. I've just opened Instagram for this little segment, and Katie Munnings is at some sort of GoPro event. Toto Wolff is adding Kimi Antonelli to a WhatsApp group in a sponsor segment. At Bathurst, there's a king brown snake, which is like the king of the brown snakes, having a face-off with a marshal that we will only assume is called Bazza, and Jensen Button is driving a Ferrari 250 Testarossa. These are just the first ones I came across. There's probably a lot more. Drivers are posting pictures with their girlfriends. They're posting pictures of them doing some sort of activity. They're allowing everybody a way into their lives and making them more personable and a little bit, well, human. And they can respond to you if you comment on their content. And like I say, it takes away a little bit of the magic. When I was a kid, my favourite WWE wrestler was Kane. 2001 era Kane, when he came back from injury, was an absolute unit, and his character, his gimmick, whatever you want to call it, was sold to everybody on his entry into the WWE, well, WWF as it was, as The Undertaker's brother. The Undertaker's brother that had been burned in a house fire as a kid, and this made him this utterly psychotic, destructive monster. But then you find out his real name is Glenn Jacobs, and he has an insurance business on the side, as well as being the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. Suddenly, Kane, this monster, suddenly becomes something else. Yes, I know it's wrestling, it's all fake, it's all scripted, but it loses a bit of the gravitas, right? The portrayal of this character suddenly becomes less of a character and he becomes more human. And that's not to say that Formula One doesn't have household names anymore. Love him or hate him, Lewis Hamilton is world famous. You've also got Verstappen, Alonso, and who knows who will be the known name in a few years' time. So when drivers become human, they become less legendary. With Formula One being the global megasport it is now because of the way it's now been presented, the way it's just everywhere, the fact that you've got Drive to Survive and other bits and pieces like that, including social media, the drivers become less of these superhuman guys that can somehow tame these uncontrollable machines that do 225 miles an hour. But when you factor in all the safety stuff that has happened since 1994, that too starts to reduce the whole, oh my god, how do they do this kind of thing. Nicholas Tombazis is currently the FIA boss of Open Wheel Racing, and he was also at Benetton in 1994. He said to the BBC, maybe there was a romantic view of the past where these guys competing were somehow gladiators or something. But that is a thing of the past. We don't assign to that. We must be as safe as possible. Every accident we examine in a lot of detail. What trajectory the car followed during the crash, what the reason was for it, there's usually a lot of factors. All of that goes into learning how to improve the cars, the track, procedures. Everything is analysed in excruciating detail by the safety department. There are always incremental changes. Fans all over the place were disappointed by the introduction of the Halo. The main reason for people being against it was, it looks ugly. But you have to accept that without it, Romain Grosjean would be dead, and Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso and Charles Leclerc would be seriously injured. It's a case of now, to be given life-threatening or life-changing injuries in a Formula One crash, you have to have had the most catastrophic of accidents where everything has to go wrong at once. Add to this the advancements in car design, from the overall shape of the car to other safety features like it being designed to split in half in a big shunt so that all the flammable bits end up away from the driver, and it makes everything feel a bit sterile. It takes away some of the gladiator aspect of the sport because the drivers are now driving super safe machines that are designed to break apart in a certain way to protect the person driving it, and the drivers are now all media trained robots that say the things that the sponsors want them to say. There's also too much runoff, and the garages are so clean you can do brain surgery in them. But that's just how the sport has evolved. But as the BBC mentioned in their piece, nothing will be as gladiatorial or as iconic as Grosjean emerging from that flaming Haas and jumping over the barrier. Formula One still has its moments. People who don't watch Formula One will have seen all of that on the news and gone, bloody hell, that's amazing. How has he done that? How has he survived that kind of crash? But compared to the 60s, fire is rare. Grosjean survived because of the Halo and because of the other safety things on board his car. But at the same time, the fact that he survived such a horrendous accident shows that the drivers are a lot tougher and the cars are a lot tougher than they otherwise appear. And there will be people commenting on this saying, oh yeah, but they were real men back in the 60s, they're too soft today, I don't like change, and that's going to be expected. And it's happening across a lot of sports now, like rugby, the NFL and the NHL. Although that hasn't stopped some members of the Boston Bruins doing stuff that would likely see them immediately pulled off the ice now. Patrice Bergeron played 2 playoff games back in 2017 or so with a punctured lung. Zdeno Chara broke his nose in the first period of one game and played the remaining 2 periods of the same game with a face mask. Greg Campbell had his leg broken by a slap shot and not only managed to palm the puck off to another player, made it back to his bench under his own steam. But those guys have largely moved on now, so this hard man stuff will all die out because the way the kids are playing the game now and being brought up playing the game is completely different to how Bergeron and Chara and those guys played it growing up. There's the old saying of football players spend 90 minutes pretending to be injured, while rugby players spend 80 minutes pretending not to be injured. But rugby players can't do that anymore because concussions are the big concern, and they're trying to avoid unnecessary long-term injuries. Accidents happen, but if you can prevent them to a certain point, it then does become unnecessary. Oliver Askew lied about a concussion and lost his IndyCar seat. Dale Jr. drove while trying to walk off a concussion on more than one occasion. And that's the thing now. Formula 1 drivers coming through in recent years, most of them are just that. Kids. Strapping an 18, 19, 20-year-old into a 225-mile-an-hour rocket ship, they're going to need some cotton wooling, especially when so much money has been sunk into them to get them to that point. Add to this, there's no doing it for the love of the game anymore because of the massive budgets required, even in the cost cap era. The days of Minardi and those guys being at the back of the grid every week and just happy to be there is long gone. The same way that James Hunt smoking, drinking and shagging his way through race weekends is also long gone. The same way that in this era of high definition broadcasts and clips going onto YouTube and Twitter within minutes of them happening, Formula 1 can't have the violent death of a driver beamed into people's homes on a Sunday afternoon. Imagine if the Premier League, the most money-heavy football league in the world, and it is money-heavy, the wages and the money involved in that league is just insane, and I say this as an English football fan, although I support a Tier 4 team. Imagine if the violence and the hooliganism of the 70s and the 80s was still happening today. It would not be a good look for anybody. So Formula 1 has to try and find some way of balancing safety and all the modern things like social media presence and the way the cars are built and the sterility of it all, while making it an exciting sport that shows off the skill that these drivers have. Because the drivers are skilled. These days, the cars look too easy to drive. The ability to generate grip to match the power has evened out, so the cars look like they're on rails. And it's a mistake a lot of people make, thinking that they are just driving and it's not that difficult. But the drivers are still incredibly fit to put up with all the G-forces that not many people get put through in their lives other than fighter pilots and astronauts. The drivers are still incredibly strong, skilled and tough, but the way the cars are these days makes it all look too easy. There's no illusion of difficulty anymore, and that's part of the issue. Martin Donnelly, a man who almost lost his life in a horrendous crash at Jerez in the early 90s, is saying that on the safety front that they cannot roll back the clock on safety, nor can team principals hold the metaphorical gun to the drivers' heads and say, "You are racing." This didn't happen at Saudi Arabia last year when missiles were raining down around them. But how do they do that? Will the 2026 regulations be a step in the right direction and making the cars be a little more on edge? Or does Formula 1 have to rely on things like Drive to Survive to help generate the whole Gladiator image? Let me know down in the comments and get a discussion going. So then, a look at the claims that Formula 1 drivers are a bit too soft these days and that Formula 1 drivers aren't the men or gladiators that they once were, and whether those claims might be a little bit misguided. If this video has given you some food for thought, then do like the video, and if you aren't subscribed to the channel and want to hear more of these opinion pieces or just watch anything else I do here, get subscribed and also get the Stefan bell on so you never miss out on any future stuff. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help support me in a more personal fashion, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and my affiliate links. There has been some new stuff uploaded to the F1 store in recent days for the upcoming races, so if you want to buy stuff, I get a little bit of a kickback, which would be a nice birthday present for me because it's my birthday on Sunday. Yay, 34 years old. There's also super thanks if you just want to buy me a coffee, and there's also memberships if Patreon isn't quite to your liking, but you still want to support. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.